Good evening and welcome to Colorado Decides, a joint production of PBS 12, CBS 4, and the Colorado Sun. I'm your host, Dominic Disutti. Thank you so much for joining us. Joining me tonight is Jason Blevins from the Colorado Sun.
Hey, Dominic.
And political analyst Eric Sondermann.
Glad to be here.
We continue our look at the major initiatives on November's ballot. Tonight's debate will examine both sides of the ballot issue that would officially reintroduce gray wolves to Colorado. Joining us for the next 30 minutes are Gary Skiba from the San Juan Citizens Alliance in support of the measure, and opponent Daler Szilagyi from the Colorado Farm Bureau against the measure. Okay, we have limited time, so let's get started. Jason, why don't we get started with your first question for Gary and Taylor?
Okay, specifically question here for Taylor. This has kind of been pitched by opponents of wolf reintroduction as an urban versus rural issue. The Stop the Wolves Coalition has something like 39 letters from boards of county commissioners across the state who are opposed to the reintroduction effort, and most of those counties are largely rural counties. The August 19 study by CSU, 2019 study, showed strong support among residents on both the Front Range and the Western Slope, and really the Eastern Plains as well. Could this be more of kind of an old economy versus new economy issue? Curious if the opponents in the Stop the Wolf Coalition folks are finding any challenges reaching kind of the growing populations of the Western Slope who maybe don't have as intimate a connection to the agricultural legacy of the region.
Well, thank you, Jason. I think that's a great question. First of all, I think I would clarify to say that this isn't necessarily an issue facing the new economy versus the old economy. This is purely an issue of good policy versus bad policy. We hear a lot about how forcing wolf introduction will have real impacts on Western Slope residents, not just agriculture. Yes, of course, I am with the Colorado Farm Bureau and we have farmers and ranchers all over the state, but this is a bigger issue. It has issue on tourism, hunting, local business that go all the way to Main Street. And you can see that by our supporters that oppose wolf introduction. As Colorado Farm Bureau, along with other agriculture organizations, make Coloradans protecting wildlife. We are actually not a part of the Stop the Wolf Coalition, just to clarify. But I think it's important to remember that this is an issue that will have real impacts for the western part of the state. You mentioned the CSU survey. I would say that survey was done earlier in the year, and after 2016, we know how seriously to take polls, I think. And as residents learn about the issue and they learn about real impacts that sort of this ballot box biology has on Colorado and has on our public lands, people choose differently, and they know that wolf introduction isn't right for Colorado. So this is bigger than just sort of new world, old world, rural, urban. This is folks choosing something that sounds nice and sounds good, that has real impacts on communities, on agriculture, on tourism, and on hunting.
Eric, you have a question you want to ask?
Sure. I guess first we should see if Gary wants in on Jason's question. Gary, do you want to comment on that, and then we'll go to another one?
Oh, sure. Not so much to Jason's question as to Taylor's response. Taylor mentioned real effects. All we have to do is look to Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming and ask what are those effects, and there are no negative effects there that are quantifiable. We have more elk in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming now than we did in 1995 when wolves were reintroduced. There's no increased loss of outfitters or of agricultural operations. So the real effects are something that there is no demonstration of that in places where there are wolves. And I'm not sure exactly what Taylor meant by good policy versus bad policy, but to me, this is the opportunity for the voters of Colorado to set policy and to say very specifically, we want wolves in Colorado. And that is the policy question. The implementation questions, as far as the biology that's involved in this issue, would be handed off to Colorado Parks and Wildlife professional biologists. And just so you know, I did work for Colorado Division of Wildlife before the merger with Parks. I worked with the commission, so I understand how that whole process works. And the biologists would be in charge of how the reintroduction occurred. It's not the question of whether there should be a reintroduction, which really is a policy question that should be answered by the voters.
Let me jump in here and I'll address this question to both Gary and Taylor. We'll start with Gary. I'm coming to you from Western Colorado. The backdrop is our home here in Tabernash. I have as we're doing this, I have a pet dog running around outside so that they're not barking and disturbing us inside. You state, Gary, that we need wolves in Colorado. I'm not sure my neighbors up here would necessarily agree with you. I would feel a little different about having a pet dog run around outside. I guess my real question is, even though every vote counts equally in Colorado, and obviously there are many people on the Front Range and over here, shouldn't Western Colorado be entitled to some special say here, given that the impacts are going to be felt by those of us who live? Gary, you first.
I had some difficulty hearing you there, Eric. You were echoing. But I think I got your question. And I think this goes back to a question that Jason asked earlier, which was, is this a Front Range versus West Slope issue? And the reality is that the poll that was done by CSU, and CSU has a number of experts who know what they're doing with polling. I find it, frankly, a little offensive to say that we shouldn't trust their polling because these people are experts at what they do. 84% of the state's population supported wolf reintroduction. That included 80% on the Western Slope. So, Eric, I don't know who your neighbors are, but from what the polling is, 80% of them want to see wolves restored.
Well, I don't want to get into debate. That's between you and Taylor. I can tell you that 80% of my neighbors certainly don't. Taylor, your comment, please.
Yeah, the Colorado Farm Bureau has 25,000 members almost 25,000 members across the state. And I haven't talked to a single farmer or rancher, folks at the Grand Junction Chamber of Commerce, at the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, and the broad coalition that don't support wolf introduction who would agree that this is how you make wildlife management decisions at the ballot box. I truly believe that this, by taking wolf introduction to the ballot, we take it out of the hands of wildlife professionals whose job it is to manage the lands that are available to our entire state, whether it be for recreation, whether it be for hunting, agriculture. Farmers and ranchers have gotten really good at working with folks like Colorado Parks and Wildlife, where Gary worked, and with other endangered species and with other wildlife management professionals. And truly, that's where this should happen. We talked, I mentioned earlier about this not being just a Western Slope issue, and we talked about CSU doing their poll. We're having the population in the Western Slope, or we're having the population and the Front Range deciding the fate and the future of our farmers and ranchers and our local tourist communities out west, where you're at even now, Eric. And I would agree that every member that we've talked to, every farmer and rancher, and everybody who's going to have to deal with wolf introduction doesn't support it. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Gary mentioned other states like Montana and Idaho. They're not Colorado. This is a very different state. Coloradans love the outdoors. It's a much smaller space than even Montana is 25% bigger than Colorado in and of itself. And I think it's important that we remember that this needs to be decided by wildlife professionals, by biologists like Gary, not at the ballot box, by folks who think it may be convenient to go to the Western Slope and think it's nice to see a wolf or hear a howl. This is real impacts for people's futures.
Let me go ahead and jump in and ask a couple of questions here. Maybe a productive way we can start with this, Gary, is let's get some details about actually what the ballot measure would do, because there's, I think, a lot of questions, folks who may not be decided on this, of what happens when gray wolves are introduced and there is a property of a rancher that is either hunted and eaten or damaged. How is it handled by this particular ballot measure? Let's go to you, Gary, first.
Well, I'm a little confused on just what you're asking, because we can talk about the ballot initiative overall, but are you asking specifically about depredation and what would be done for ranchers? Is that your question, or the overall question about the ballot initiative?
I guess let's get specifically with if there's compensation, if something, if this is approved and wolves are reintroduced, and a rancher in the middle of Colorado loses livestock to wolves, is there some sort of compensation involved? Let's get into those details.
Sure. Yeah, and there is. The ballot initiative requires a compensation program, and anybody that's supportive of wolf reintroduction will freely admit that compensation programs are not 100% perfect. So there's no question about that, but they are an effort to compensate ranchers and farmers for any losses that they have. So that is an existing methodology that will be that is in the ballot initiative that would be required. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a great deal of experience of working with landowners for compensation on things like crop damage, damage to beehives from bears, loss of livestock to mountain lions or black bears. So the experience is there. They know how to do it. It's just a matter of the details of the system. And those details would be worked out after the initiative. There's no way that those details could be included in the initiative. They would be worked out through the planning process over a period of 2.5 to 3 years after the initiative passes.
So let me follow up now with Taylor. Taylor, how do ranchers handle, and if I'm using the terminology incorrectly, I apologize, but other apex predators like mountain lions and bears and damage that would come along there? What is the big concern, I guess the big difference between how damage from other predators that are currently in Colorado and probably in plentiful numbers to what would happen with wolves? What's the key difference we should know?
Well, the key difference isn't necessarily in the type of animal that farmers and ranchers have to deal with. Farmers and ranchers don't raise their livestock to be taken from them by wildlife. They've worked very, very hard to coexist with our wildlife populations across the West. And agriculture is having a hard time. COVID-19 has not only impacted everybody's daily lives, but in the 8th year of low farm income, farmers and ranchers are hurting. They're hurting from the drought, and having to face one more threat like the wolf could put people over the edge. Our folks, the reason Colorado Farm Bureau and Colorado Cattlemen's Association and the Colorado Wool Growers got involved with this initiative from the very beginning, because they're scared. They can't take one more hit. Life is hard enough for them. And I think it's not less about the differences between the wolf and the bear and those semantics that should be dealt with by Parks and Wildlife and not at the ballot. They're scared that their fate's going to be decided for them by a yes or no checkbox. It's much more complicated than that. It's much more complicated than just, oh, well, you lost a cow, here's some money. This is about livelihoods and about the future and about their local communities.
Jason, why don't we go to you to a couple more questions?
Okay. Hey, Dominic, I have a little perspective on how other states have handled livestock loss. I've spoken at length with a fellow named George Edwards, who's the executive director of the Montana Livestock Loss Board. Last year, the Montana legislature increased his budget to $300,000 a year. That was an increase from $200,000 a year. In 2008, when Montana estimated there were about 500 wolves in the state, his board paid about $87,000 to ranchers who lost 238 animals to wolves. Last year, with the wolf population around 900 in Montana, he paid $76,000 to ranchers for about 80 animals lost. The last 3 years, the biggest losses of livestock in Montana have come from grizzly bears. So it's pretty interesting to see that perspective. That Montana Livestock Board has been paying ranchers for 11 years, and they have a pretty good perspective on what livestock reimbursement might look like in Colorado. So I think it's worth our time to kind of go look at what Montana's done, because they're way ahead of us here. But Gary, maybe riff a bit on how this reintroduction effort jives with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposal last year to delist the gray wolf as an endangered species. Seems to present the idea that gray wolf reintroduction has been successful, and if that's true, why not just wait for wolves to simply migrate south into Colorado, which, judging from sightings in Northwest Colorado, is already happening, right?
There is evidence that there are wolves there, but I think the other thing that I frankly just learned today is that of those animals that were there, they believe there were 6 animals. 3 of those animals have been killed in Wyoming. So we know that that is the problem. The number of wolves that are migrating south have to go across the killing field of southern Wyoming, and it's a very, very difficult trip for wolves to make. The ones that have made it have been killed or died one way or another. So we believe, as biologists, not as policymakers, but as biologists, that the likelihood of establishing a population of wolves, a viable population, through natural migration from the north will not happen. It just doesn't seem likely. And again, the evidence that we've seen from the most recent activities in the northwest part of the state make it pretty clear that is the case. These animals are not going to be able to survive under the current conditions.
Should I jump, this is Eric, should I jump in here? Or Jason, do you have a follow-up?
No, I'm all good. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I guess I'll just follow up on that. I mean, there are some wolves here. I think there can be, that's generally stipulated. Gary just talked about how some have been killed in southern Wyoming or have maybe migrated back north from here. But for both sides, let me start with Taylor. If you accept the premise that there are some wolves here through natural course, not as a function of any ballot initiative or policy, what is the danger of introducing a few more?
Thanks for that question, Eric. I think that's an example of why this ballot initiative isn't necessary. If the wolves are here, if they're coming here, and if as Gary has said, some have been killed in southwestern Wyoming, it shows how fragile wildlife management is. We may not like wolves to be here. Farmers and ranchers in Western Colorado may not like the fact that wolves are moving here naturally, but if they're moving here naturally, we're going to have to deal with it. The ballot initiative is not natural. And by forcing nature's hand, by not letting wildlife remain wildlife, we're risking the impacts that we don't know what's going to happen. We've talked about Montana, and we've talked about other states having to deal with wolf introduction there. It's important to remember that Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife had the opportunity to put wolves in Colorado, and they didn't. They didn't forcibly put them here. They put them in surrounding states. And if the environment is right, I'm not a biologist, which is why I don't think this is necessary, that we should have non-biologists making wildlife management decisions. But if the wolves decide that this is a good place for them, if they do come here naturally, then we'll have to live with that. But this shouldn't happen at the ballot box.
And Gary, let me just ask you the corollary question, which is, given that there are wolves here, given that some have made the trek, some haven't, according to your information, why not just let nature take its course, and why force the issue?
I believe I addressed that already. We believe, as biologists, from everything we know about population biology and what we've seen on the ground with wolves trying to make it to Colorado, or ones that have made it, they are not able to establish a population. They will be killed. And that's what's happening. There's no way that those animals are going to be able to establish a viable population. And part of the question of viability of wolf populations is genetic health of the populations. If you have one group of wolves, one male, one female, that have one pack that starts in northwest Colorado, and those animals then breed, pretty soon you're breeding brothers and sisters, and we all know what that does. And it's very, very clear that that's what happens with wolves. The wolves on Isle Royal in Lake Superior were started with a very small population, and those animals, every one of them, has genetic deformities now because of the small number of wolves.
Dominic, if you can allow me a follow-up with Gary, you really haven't addressed the core issue, and I apologize for the echo again, but you haven't addressed the core issue of what is the benefit of wolf reintroduction to the state, not the benefit to wolves, but to the benefit to the people of Western Colorado and the entire state. How do I personally benefit from this reintroduction?
Exactly.
Okay, the way that you benefit, or the state of Colorado benefits, is in multiple ways. There's no question, and I want to go back because this addresses something that Taylor said. She said we shouldn't force nature's hand. We did force nature's hand. We we eradicated wolves very, very specifically, and that was forcing nature's hand. We did that 80 years ago. It's only 80 years. Wolves evolved in the state of Colorado for tens of thousands of years with their prey, and they were functioning perfectly fine. When Europeans reached Colorado, there were plenty of elk, there were plenty of wolves, there were plenty of everything. We eradicated wolves. We forced nature's hand. What we're doing is, with this ballot initiative, is correcting an ethical and ecological wrong that we made. So, and what wolves will do, and I'm not going to say that wolves will do exactly what they did in Yellowstone, that everything is going to happen the same way. It's unlikely that it will, because natural processes are simply complicated. And so, but we do know that wolves have a number of effects on ecosystems and on their prey populations, all of which are beneficial because they evolved together for tens of thousands of years. That's what happened. They worked well together. They were a well-oiled machine. We broke that machine. We have the opportunity to bring the machine back.
Let me go ahead and jump in here. We're getting close to the end of the show, but I've got time for another couple of questions, both for Gary and Taylor. Gary, I want to start with you. The idea of who's voting on this, and that this issue is coming to a vote of the people statewide, there are likely going to be citizens in Denver who are going to likely be voting on a pit bull ban for their own city, that might be voting against pit bulls in their own city, but for wolves that they'll never be anywhere near. Now, those are two different issues, but it's still the whole idea of who's deciding what for which area. And I just want your perspective on why this is going to the voters and not staying within the state legislature for that kind of a policy decision.
Well, the reason it's not in the legislature is because proponents of wolf restoration made multiple attempts to get it addressed in the legislature and were rebuffed at every point. And so after years of attempting to get either Colorado Parks and Wildlife, now that agency, or the legislature to address wolf restoration, the proponents took this in the only other route that was available, which is through the ballot initiative. And that's why it is going the way that it is. And it is not only to the lands in western Colorado, they belong to everybody. They belong to grandmothers in Harlem. They belong to people in San Francisco. They're all of our public lands. Everybody really has a stake in this beyond the people on the west slope and the east slope. And we have the opportunity again, as I said, to correct an egregious wrong that we made.
So Taylor, let me get it back to you about, again, that decision. If there already is part of this program that if this ballot issue passes, that there will be compensation, what is the real harm that ranchers fear if property will be reimbursed if it is damaged or killed by wolf reintroduction?
Well, again, Dominic, farmers and ranchers don't raise their livestock to be taken by wildlife. And I think it's important to remember, too, that it's bigger than farmers and ranchers. We have a very broad coalition. This isn't just the Colorado Farm Bureau. Coloradans Protecting Wildlife and the Vote No on 114 initiative includes businesses, it includes chambers of commerce, it includes tourism agencies, includes hunting and fishing. This has a much bigger impact than just farmers and ranchers. This Colorado that we know is much different than it was 80 years ago. The wolves may be gone because of humans, but it's unfair to assume that humans to decide that wolves should be here now. Especially when Parks and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife have had the opportunity to bring them here and they haven't. This is going to have bigger impacts, and it's bigger than farming and ranching. We need to make sure that while the public lands belong to everybody on the Front Range, it's only when it's convenient for them. Everybody on the western slope who has to live with wolves every day, who has to see wolves every day, and who has worked their entire lives to build partnerships with the local wildlife that already exists, now has to face whatever these unknown consequences are from wolves, when we even know, as we talked about earlier, that they're already here. This is bigger than just farming and ranching.
Well, now it's time to get to our closing statements. So we flipped a coin before the debate. Taylor, you'll be first with your 30-second closing statement.
Great. Thank you, Dominic. I would just encourage all Coloradans to vote no on wolf introduction. COVID-19 has hit us all very hard this year. We have had huge impacts. Something we haven't been able to talk about today is the financial impacts that this is going to have on the state budget. We are in a $3 billion hole. And by forcing wolf introduction, we're going to be taking money away from schools, from updates from things like infrastructure that already don't have the funding that they need to be where they should be, all for a ballot initiative that should be done by wildlife management, folks like Colorado Parks and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who have already decided that this isn't the place for wolves. If wolves are here naturally, which we know they are, the opponents of this measure are going to have to deal with that. But we need to let nature be nature. We need to make this a biology question, scientific question, not a political question, and asking Coloradans to decide the fate of Western Colorado at the ballot box. So I would encourage everybody to vote no on Proposition 114 and visit www.rethinkwolves.com for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. And to you, Gary, for your 30-second closing statement.
Obviously, I'm going to urge everybody to vote yes, and I want to address a couple of specific comments Taylor made. The cost in terms of what we expect wolf restoration to cost is roughly $1 million a year. That is 1/2 of 1% of CPW's budget, not 1% of the state budget, but of CPW's. CPW can easily afford that by looking at the priorities that they have and refund and also using dollars that they have from other sources, including federal funds. As far as livestock depredation, Taylor has mentioned several times that there are these effects. If you look again to Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, those effects are not there. They're very, very minor. 1 out of 10,000 cattle in Montana were killed by wolves last year. 1 out of 10,000, 0.01%, 0.001%. And the last thing I want to address is the idea of this ballot box biology. I work for the agency. The policies that are made by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission are political decisions. They're the ones that make those decisions. They are not biological decisions, and that's appropriate. That's the purpose of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. But those decisions were not made on biology, they were made on politics. And that's not the way to do it. And I believe that the voters of Colorado should have every right in the world to make a decision that they want wolves in Colorado, and I hope that they do that. Thank you.
Well, that is indeed all the time we have for our debate about the reintroduction of gray wolves into Colorado. I'd like to thank both of our panelists, of course, Eric Sondermann and the great Jason Blevins from Colorado Sun. And I'd like to thank our ballot representatives, Gary Skiba and Taylor Szilagyi. If you'd like to find out more information about this year's general election issues, please go to our websites at pbs12.org, cbsdenver.com, and of course, coloradosun.com. Next week, we have a great double feature. At 7 p.m., we'll host a debate all about the proposal for voter approval on fees at 7:30 and at 7 o'clock. And at 7:30, the Gallagher debate. For all you fiscal policy fans, next Friday is your big night. For everyone here at PBS 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.